Policy Center. We have with us today Mr. Manoj Ramani, who is head of China Studies Program and also chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Research Program at Takshashila Institution. He will be speaking here on his new book, Smokeless War, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance. Mr. Ramani's research focuses on Chinese foreign policy, politics, and approaches to new technologies. He curates a weekly brief, Eye on China, which tracks developments in China from an Indian perspective. His work has been featured in a number of publications, such as the Indian Express, Al Jazeera, the Hindustan Times, Japan Times, and The Diplomat. Previously, Mr. Ramani spent over a decade working as a journalist in India and China, where he helped set up digital newsrooms and train young journalists. Chairing the session this afternoon is Ambassador Nambiar, former Ambassador, High Commissioner to China, Algeria, Afghanistan, Malaysia, and Pakistan, an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Before we begin, I would like to remind our participants that during the duration of the event, all participants except the speaker shall remain muted. Participants are requested to send in their questions via the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I will now invite the chair, Ambassador Nambiar, to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rija. Since Rija has done both the technical, the clarifications about the technicalities of this webinar, as well as introduced Manoj, it makes my life a lot much simpler. Let me get straight into the discussion. Let me first of all, of course, say how happy I am to be part of today's discussion of Manoj Ramani's latest book called Smokeless Wars, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance. I think it's, as my colleague and friend Shankar just said, there's been a spate of books on China by Indian authors, and it's a good trend, I think, and it shows, it's also shows a rather strong sort of focus on researched material rather than just one's own experience as such. Now, as you can see, the main message of the book's title, that the signal that it sends out is one of war, even though it's a smokeless war. And the subliminal message, I think, of the subtitle is dominance. Now, admittedly, this is about China's war against the COVID pandemic and how it has achieved dominance over it. But a larger point that is abundantly clear is that these terms also represent the central theme of the China story today. What the world is facing is not just what they call a peaceful rise of China, but a smokeless war accompanying that rise. And the world must confront the dilemma posed by its dominance at various levels. Now, already you are seeing a major doctrinal shift that has taken place under Xi Jinping from Deng Xiaoping's strategy of Caogang Yanghui to what has been called Xinxing Guanxi, as they say. Even though at a formal level, the party continues self-consciously to speak of non-interference and non-pursuit of hegemony, even these principles are modified and given Chinese characteristics. China stresses its own self-image as building a new type of what they call major country relations. And it stresses its own self-image as building a new type of major country relations, new style of international relations, new kinds of ties with neighboring countries based on what they call Qincheng Hui Rong. That is amity, sincerity, mutual benefit, and inclusiveness, and a new outlook on global governance. In fact, Xinxing, what they call Xinxing Chuanqiu Shili Guan or whatever. All of this adds up to what they call the Community of Shared Future for Mankind. I like to call it CSFM for short. But in fact, much of the details of this vision are entirely self-serving. Even in respect of neighbors, today China speaks approvingly of constructive intervention and creative involvement diplomacy, what they call Xinxing Guanxi, or Gansha, this thing, what a Chuangzhao Xing Jie Ru. It's very interesting. In practice, what we are seeing is a new generation of Chinese diplomatic assertiveness and aggressiveness based on a cold-blooded assessment of its own national interest in a highly differentiated, of course, and connected world. China's leaders are obviously in a hurry to show their own people and the outside world that the country has arrived on the world scene and cannot any longer be ignored or relegated to secondary status on any issue relevant to its national interest. All this, of course, is neither surprising nor unexpected. To expect otherwise from a country like China would be unreal. Even here in North India, we often hear the expression popularized in Bollywood cinema, which is common in the Indian political vocabulary. The word, I don't know whether you know about this, Manoj, it's called varchasva. I don't know if you've heard of that. It means dominance or hegemony, or being and staying on the top. That's what China seeks to do in the world. In his book, of course, Manoj speaks of discourse power, which is at one level translates into the right to speak. But at another level, obviously, it connotes the ability to dictate the narrative. And yet, as the author states quite categorically, this is mainly a book of the pandemic and the way in which it was experienced at the many levels within China. In the preface itself, the author underlines what the purpose of the book is, and he makes 4 important points, which I think I need to mention in a slightly differentiated manner. This is a book on contemporary history, but it identifies certain trends that will shape the future of the world order, he says. In January this year, Xi Jinping spoke at a major party conclave where he underlined that while China's development was still in a period of important strategic opportunities, both the domestic and international environment are undergoing profound and complex changes, and time and momentum was on China's side. 2, the book explains how China's leaders responded to the trajectory of the pandemic and the way in which foreign policy has played handmaiden to domestic policy. It shows also how China's response to the pandemic has resonated around the world. What the implication of this will be for the long-term image of China will remain to be seen still, but the resilient and orderly way in which it has emerged from the crisis has certainly been very impressive, as also its acute sensitivity to the perceptions of the outside world. A third point he makes is that while many governments had adopted the narrative of the people's war, we in India have seen this also, and used mass mobilization methods to empower the state in the manner they empower the state. The words mass mobilization, what these may have been, while these may have been effective inside China, it may be useful to ask how successfully has state power been leveraged and to what effect in other countries, including India. I suppose that will come up in the discussion. It quite certainly, I think, will. The author emphasizes that the pandemic has shifted the power dynamic between the citizen and the state. That's a very interesting point, I think. Manoj says that the fresh focus on state agency and the Chinese experience shows that for the future, there is a decisive shift in power to the state. Now, I think it may well be something like that, maybe expect or hoped in India, but I'm not sure that it's happening. Today, Manoj says there are debates on the invasion of privacy and regulation of new technologies have been pushed to the background. Now, it is germane to ask whether this has happened in India also. Given the performance of both the state and the central governments, I'm not so sure. If this is so, does it mean that we are the exception and have different experiences because of the nature of Indian society and our particular experiences? Now, whatever the differences we might like to draw with regard to the experiences of the pandemic, what struck me most were the similarities at the ground level between the experiences of the people who faced the wrath of the pandemic, as well as the touching similarity of the human condition in both countries. I was also strongly impressed by the stories of the many courageous COVID warriors who in China, as in India, played monumentally courageous roles in combating this dreaded disease. I will not go very much further in any detail, nor take away time from the author, Mr. Manoj Keval Ramani. I just would like to end by referring to a passage towards the end of the book where the author quotes Wang Jinbei's argument that while previous Chinese leaders believed that China was at the periphery or semi-periphery of a Western-dominated international system, for Xi today, China was moving to its very center. In fact, just today's, I think, was it today or yesterday, Manoj, in his daily brief, talked about the party centenary, and he refers to what is called the ABCDE secret of the success of the. Oh, sorry, I think I'll have to just cancel this. ABCDE secret of the success of the Chinese Communist Party, while the new China research report clearly says that the Chinese Communist Party does not seek to export the Chinese model internationally, it is abundantly clear that she firmly believes that China must not only develop the capacity, but also demonstrate the will to what he calls engineer a more favorable international environment. What is this environment? I think that is what I call the CSFM, the Community of Shared Future. I spoke at the beginning. With these, I give over I give over the floor to you, Manoj. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nambe. Thank you so much for that absolutely wonderful introduction and excellent summary of what the book actually talks about. Before I sort of begin, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Rijan Nair for reaching out to me. Thank you to Samanvay for arranging all of this. And of course, thank you to Ambassador Kansa and everybody at ICS for hosting me. This is really an honor, a pleasure, and a privilege for me to be doing this. I wanted to first sort of talk about why I wrote this book. And when, I mean, in the book, I talk about when the sort of first seeds of the idea of, writing this book come. And that's a product of an article in The Economist, which talks about, which soon after the opening of Wuhan talks about
Ah, no, you're not. We can't hear you, Manoj.
hear me?
Yeah, I think you're still. Yeah, just come. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so it was a product of this article in The Economist, which I was reading, and which sort of said, "Is China winning?" And what does China mean here in this context, and what does winning mean in this context? And unless you have that clarity, it's extremely difficult to figure out what do you mean by all these terms. And the effort of the book is to essentially unpack some of these questions and try and tell the story of 2020 in terms of how the Chinese Communist Party essentially contained the virus, what were its diplomatic responses, what were its narrative responses, what were its political responses, and of course, what were its economic responses. And that was my aim, to try and do that. Because, and again, it was a choice to sort of write a trade book rather than an academic book, a trade book which is well researched, because my sense, particularly over the last few years of observing discourse in the Indian media and public discourse in India, is that it's not necessarily informed by the right sources. And what I mean by that is that Global Times gets an undue amount of coverage in India, and we don't actually look at what's happening in the country. And the other sort of challenge that I have with Indian public discourse is that it's not engaging China and the developments in China from a prism of what's happening within the country. How is the party talking to itself? It's essentially engaging and trying to understand China from our own prism, which is fair, but we need to also have a broader view to be able to understand what's actually shaping policies and actions in the country. So with that said, I have a short presentation. There are many aspects of the book, and I thought that I'd sort of focus on a couple of them in this conversation. I'll just share my slides. Right. Okay, I hope you can see what I'm sharing.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So this is the structure of what I want to talk about. I wanted to initially talk about the title, which Ambassador Nambi spoke about, and I also wanted to talk about the concept of the People's War and how those sort of blended together, and then a little bit about discourse power and how what were the hard and soft measures that were used by the Communist Party to shape discourse during the pandemic. And then finally, a little bit about the consequences of what's happened in 2020 and the pitfalls for the party going forward. The first point that I wanted to make was this, that, the idea of the smokeless war sort of came out in the context of the pandemic containment effort that the Communist Party was engaging in. They defined it as a war without smoke, which sort of sent the message that this is a wartime effort, which again has its own connotations. And of course, Xi Jinping in early February talks about this as the People's War, which again has its own connotations in terms of
we can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think there's an issue with my headphones, but yeah.
Okay.
Let me just reshare the screen so that it's. Okay. So the point was that the central leadership is essentially sending a message saying that this is a top priority for the central leadership. And that was an important message to send, particularly after what happened in the early days in January in Wuhan, where it was very, very clear that the local leadership had failed, and the central leadership was keen to showcase that this was a local level failure in some way. And the central leadership is now in control and it's taking charge of the situation, and therefore it will be responding promptly. And that sort of assurance goes in throughout the system and to the public. At a certain level, it's also sending a message of elite unity, because at the moment you frame something in the context of a war, and this happens in other countries also, even in India, the moment you frame something in the context of a war, it's required for the political class or the elite in the country to come together. And at that point of time, if you see disunity, if you see voices of dissent and grumbling, it's much more easier to crack down on them, even in democratic societies, but far be it in China. And so there's a messaging of consequences, which obviously takes place also because the leadership in Wuhan gets sacked. The third key point was mass mobilization. And this was not just in terms of mobilization of the party cadre and grassroots cadre. This was also about mass mobilization across society, whether you were an ordinary person, just like we saw in India, whether you're an ordinary person who's sitting at home, the idea that you're being at home and you're serving your country and you're serving this wartime effort. The idea that cadres must mobilize, take the sort of reins in their hand and must do everything that's needed, that it's keeping people indoor, making sure that they get the rations that are needed, ensure that testing is carried out and the rest of it, and also mobilizing the private sector. So this was a society-wide effort, and the sort of connotation of the People's War and the Smokeless War sort of gives that messaging out, and it sort of enables you to do some of these things. And that's sort of part of the socio-political signaling, right? You're signaling to society also that this is something extraordinary. So even the ordinary freedoms that you enjoy, if they are no longer the way they were, that's perfectly fine. And you need to be accepting of that, because this is an extraordinary moment and you're part of something bigger, and you need to therefore fall in line. And if you don't fall in line, of course, there are consequences. And it sort of legitimizes some of the actions that you may want to take because you feel that's necessary, and it reduces the contestation with regard to those actions. Again, harking back to the concept of the People's War, it sends the signal that this will be a protracted effort. This is not something for a week, 2 weeks, a month. This is a long-term effort. And this was also important from the point of view of the messaging with regard to the economy, because you're going to need to take certain short-term measures, but the impact is going to be long-term. So even sort of if you stabilize immediately, that's not sufficient. There are going to be long-term consequences. This is going to be a protracted affair, and those steps will need to be taken for a continued period of time. And we're seeing that today, where even today we're seeing that while there's no more stimulus, what's happening is that there's still much more money being directed towards, say, ensuring employment, making sure that small enterprises and businesses sustain and survive, while Xi Jinping may have gotten back to his debt restructuring and financial risk management efforts. Shaping opinion. Again, the idea of the People's War was also about getting the masses on your side. And all of that, again, like I said, it sort of coincides with the concept of a smokeless war, that opinion management and getting people on board is critical. And that's a large part of what the book talks about. That the effort was also to make sure that people understood, agreed, and followed what the party wanted to, and believed that things were getting better. And the final thing in all of this is, of course, discourse contestation, because at the end of the day, the party saw that there's going to be discourse contestation from very early on. In late January, we saw them getting really angry about countries imposing travel bans. Subsequently, even the nature of the coverage that was happening in the international press, the party was extremely angry about it, and it took issue with a lot of things that were said in the international press. And it realized very early on that it needs to contest this discourse, because the discourse was about this being a black swan moment, this being a test for the party and a potential existential crisis, and the systemic failure of the system of this Communist Party-led governance system, where essentially information doesn't necessarily flow to the top, or where different political priorities make sure that and lead to a position where people's lives are not necessarily respected. And that sort of discourse contestation was going to happen. And you saw the party sort of gird up and decide that, okay, we need to compete in this ecosystem, and they did it in different ways. And that's what I'm going to sort of talk about next. All of this I frame in the context of, obviously, this idea of discourse power, and this image of Mao with Edgar Snow is, again, something that's relevant even today, given the talk about journalists, the Chinese Foreign Ministry talking about journalists needing to be more like Edgar Snow, and needing to talk more about, they're even setting up a Edgar Snow newsroom. I think China Daily has done that. And of course, from Xi Jinping's point of view, very early when he comes to power, I document in the book that he starts talking about this idea of telling China's story well. And that's a realization that you need to compete in this international marketplace for ideas. And that's sort of, and he starts to talk about what sort of capacity do you need, and what do you need to actually tell China's story well. It's not just about going out there and repeating party propaganda, because that's not digestible to a large majority of us sitting outside. But how do you make it relevant to people outside? How do you make it nimble? How do you make it prompt? How do you make it more appealing in terms of the platforms that you use, in terms of the tools that you use? And what connects with people outside, and what sort of diversity should there be, rather than there being homogeneity in messaging? And we've seen over the last 6, 7, 8 years this develop. Right. One of the sort of driving forces for this to develop was that, and I document again this in the book, that there's a shift in mentality from initially being extremely defensive, where you're trying to sort of push, you're trying to dismiss this idea that China's rise is a threat. And one of the sort of earliest examples of this, in the last decade or so that comes to mind is when this idea of peaceful rise gets sort of repackaged into peaceful development. That's the sort of sensitivity to anything that is perceived as problematic. Of course, that sensitivity has gone, it's been left to the dustbin of history, but that's the sort of approach, that you were defensive and you wanted to frame your narrative in a different way, non-threatening way. And that sort of gradually starts to change. At a certain point of time, you see the party saying, look, old cricket logic, offense is the best defense. You need to go on the offensive. You need to actually actively shape the narrative outside, because you're going to have to compete in that marketplace. And gradually you see this sort of offensive in terms of, China being able to provide solutions, the Chinese system being effective at home, and also offering a model. How far does the party believe this model is actually replicable in other countries is another matter. I don't think that they genuinely believe that this model is replicable in its entirety. But there is a certain sense that, if you shape the norms, reshape the norms that existed on certain issues, plus if you shape the norms and standards of the future, you make the world much more safe for yourself. And I think that's part of what's going on. And that's part of this sort of evolution of this need for discourse power. In this realization of what discourse power is, and there's a deep debate through the sort of mid 2000s and even today with regard to what exactly does discourse power comprise. one component of it is very clear that at the end of the day, there has to be power. And power defined in the context of your ability to influence and shape the actions of others. And of course, the multiple tools that you use for this, and the multiple tools that from a Chinese Communist Party's perspective were your economy, your military, your system, your history, your culture. So it's not just a coincidence that at a certain point of time in 2013, 2014, CCTV was paying big money to broadcast the New Year's Gala at Times Square. It was trying to do that because it saw that as one component of this larger toolkit of power. But power is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's insufficient in some ways, because you need legitimacy to be able to shape the discourse, and it goes hand in hand. You need to sort of, your power needs to underwrite. You need to be able to underwrite the creation of a shared set of rules and norms, which will then confer legitimacy to you as those rules and norms get shared. And I think that's the sort of contestation that's going on right now. And I try to document this in the book, that's the sort of discourse and debate that's going on within the country among the sort of think tank expert community, strategic affairs analysts. How Xi Jinping sort of goes about creating this capacity, I mean, I look at it in a threefold framework. One is to contain, which is with regard to containing this sort of infiltration of foreign values and ideas, and also redefining certain terms, whether it's, constitutionalism, whether it's, what does that mean in the Chinese sense, whether it's democracy, whether it's freedom, and, do all of that. And that's the sort of first thing, is where you sort of contain and then you start to construct as you're redefining these terms. And in that process of redefining, there's a certain, set of tools that they use. And Hu Jintao, before he left the scene, he sort of talked about core socialist values. And for me, I traveled to Beijing in early 2012, late 2012 and early 2013. And when you were there, you had these sort of markers all around the city with regard to some of these values, big posters around the city with Xi Jinping and these values, and of course the China dream. And the idea here is that you're classifying these core socialist values at different levels in different categories. There's a national level, a societal level, and an individual level. So at the end of the day, these are going to inform, and these have since informed how your system is being constructed in terms of your system of governance, in terms of laws, and in terms of how you think about these things. So if you think about, say, the concept of digital sovereignty or data sovereignty or cyber sovereignty, any of these concepts, you will see that individual freedom is not necessarily your primary objective when you're thinking of something like this. And that's because at a value level, firstly, freedom is not an individual value, it's a societal value. So at the end of the day, an individual's freedom can be easily sacrificed or can be sort of from a normative point of view, sacrificed for social good. But that's sort of, it then starts to inform how your legislation gets made and how legislation gets interpreted and how that plays out in the sort of entire legal system of the country. I've given you the example of the cyber laws, cyber sort of conceptualization of the new cyber standards and things like that. But if you think of also, say, the national security law in Hong Kong, where freedom, if you see the debate over, the freedom to protest, it's immediately countered by the idea of, well, what about the freedom of peaceful, peaceful livelihood for taxi drivers and things like that. And you see that sort of discourse contestation take place. And eventually, when it reaches a point which the party feels is crossing a certain bottom line, of course, the idea of, we're imposing this law to maintain prosperity, democracy, harmony, so that national priority comes in play. And you can see how this has played out with regard to the national security law in Hong Kong. I want to go back a little bit. Yeah. The third thing was to propagate. How do you cultivate the tools to propagate? Because Chinese media, again, was predominantly, in many ways, if you look at it about a decade and a half ago, in some ways very insular. The primary objective is domestic, and to be able to shape discourse domestically and to be able to communicate the parties and the state's narrative domestically. This also has sort of shaped has been shaped far more after 2008 and 2009, where the media space for reportage has shrunk. And personally, having worked with CGTN, the experience that I had was that increasingly in the 3 years that I was there, you could sort of sense how things were changing, how people were getting far more cautious, how it was far more difficult to even debate things would otherwise would not be necessarily terribly contentious. Something like, say, LGBTQ rights, to be able to do something like that and have a conversation about that was also becoming extremely contentious. And the boundaries for, initially at a certain point of time, you would think of Chinese media as pushing the boundary of discourse outward, if you were to imagine a circle. But what one saw, what one has seen, is that that circle has begun to shrink far more. And it's made it much more difficult for journalists to operate in China with a greater degree of freedom. And it's also directed the media, by and large, to serve the interests of the party and the state. And I think that's one of the things domestically that's happened. Internationally, what's happened is that there's been far greater investment in media outlets abroad. And that's the sort of you're using your economic power to do that. There's also been a realization that you can, without necessarily, just investing a lot of money, you can build partnerships in countries particularly in countries where there is very little reportage about China and there's very little capacity or interest in the media to actually expend resources to report about China. So you can enter into syndication partnerships and you can be providing them all the China-related content, which automatically starts to shape domestic discourse. And this is evident in a lot of countries in Eastern Europe. The other component is, of course, BRI. I think the last that I recall, that BRI media partnership had about 182 different countries, which are sort of partnering in that. Not 182 countries, sorry, 182 different partnerships that existed under the BRI sort of media forum. And that's significant because it starts to you start to engage with different countries and their media outlets in dialogue, and you start to try to shape views about China in that context. Also, of course, platforms like party-to-party dialogues. We've seen this in the last couple of weeks in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, where political parties across the spectrum sit and engage with the Communist Party, and then they issue a statement congratulating them on their centenary. So these are the different tools that you're cultivating. Of course, the other components of this are things like international institutions, where you're expanding, where you're trying to sort of gain far greater ground in key agencies, say in the UN, where you're trying to work with other countries to try and create greater space for yourself, whether it's at the IMF, where you're sort of establishing new institutions like the AIIB, or whether you're strengthening old institutions like the SCO, or FOCAC, and so on and so forth. You're engaging in that sort of mini multilateralism or regional multilateralism, with China engaging with a region in itself. And you're trying to sort of push your message through these different groupings by creating centers of power. And in the pandemic, we saw this, particularly when you had that extraordinary meeting between the Communist Party and African countries, between China and the African countries, the Solidarity Summit. The summit was not just about the pandemic. One of the key points in the joint statement that was issued was about how those countries support China's sort of political position on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and so on and so forth, which had nothing to do with the pandemic. So you're trying to create these nerve centers of power through which you can send your message and also shape the external environment. Now, how did all this play out in the pandemic? That's what I try to talk about in the book. There are sort of soft measures that they adopted, and there were hard measures that they adopted. And Ambassador Nambia spoke about the stories of Corona warriors. To me, what was interesting was not just the stories, but also how they were told. It moved from obviously very bland, stodgy, propaganda, and this is again a gradual trend, right? It's moved from that to far more exciting, far more engaging stories. Some analysts call it Hollywoodification. To me, when I was reading one of the stories that I actually cite in the book of a Beijing-based driver, Sun Yang, and he's suddenly received a call while he's in the supermarket shopping for dinner, and he receives this call that you need to deliver these components of China Mobile for the Hoshanshan hospital that's being constructed in Wuhan. And he thinks to himself, and he writes, and the story mentions that he sort of thought to himself that I knew the situation was serious. I didn't bother about the money, and I decided to, leave the fruits and the meat and vegetable that I was picking up and just picked up a bag of, instant noodles, and I drove with the materials. And then at a certain point of time, he stops at a service station, and the gentleman at the service station gives him a mask, and he sort of informs him that he's going to Wuhan. And the guy at the service station tells Sun Yang that, things are difficult over there. Take care of yourself, my friend. And to me, immediately in my mind, Sun Yang was Salman Khan for some reason. And just, the idea of the way that story was told, it sort of captivated me. And I think that's the effort. The effort is to try and appeal to you at an emotional level, which is not necessarily bad, because at the end of the day, it's also important to recognize that the people who are suffering, who suffered from the pandemic in China, are not very different from the people who are suffering in India or the United States. We're all human beings. But from the party's point of view, this also sort of ties in domestically to this framework of participatory persuasion, which Maria Repnikova and Kirchen Fang talk about. And it's really fascinating, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you are trying to make the people who are your target for your propaganda as collaborators, as partners, and you're telling sort of your stories through them. Because at the end of the day, the story that you're telling is about the efficiency of the party in having mobilized these resources and having inspired people in some way to be able to address what was a national disaster, a national calamity. I think some of the other sort of measures I've listed out here, I mean, what are the priorities of the party state? That's what we need to think about when we think about some of these stories, is that the priorities are to send the message that the party wants to send. And the most glaring example of this to me is how the People's Daily covered the pandemic in the first 10, 12 days, even after the shutdown in Wuhan. It was missing from the front pages. What came about was when Xi Jinping had a Politburo meeting or a PSC meeting, and he sort of had a comment about what we need to do. That was covered, but otherwise it was missing. It wasn't the biggest news story for the longest time, until it was clear that the central leadership has its narrative figured out. And once that happened, you saw it far more prominently covered. It dispatched journalists. There was a point of time where some 300 journalists were dispatched across the country, across Wuhan and Hubei, to specifically go and tell positive stories. The focus was on efficiency, performance, as you saw the live streaming of the two hospitals, and of course, even accountability, where they tried to sort of showcase how, they tried to sort of send a message that if you fail at a level of governance in the party also, there will be costs, which again is a positive message that they sent out by sacking specific individuals in Wuhan and Hubei, and subsequently also in other parts of the country as they failed. And to me, that was this is sort of comprised the soft measures that were adopted. Again, one of these examples of the national mourning. To me, this is a fantastic example of politics in China, which often gets ignored by people outside, that there is tremendous politics that take place in China. It's not just because it's a unitary party state system that, authority and power very easily flows from top to bottom and everything gets done. There's tremendous political theater also that takes place, along with contestation inside the party. Again, some of these examples of what was happening. This was a quote from the book that was published, from which I took the story of Sun Yang, which was again a collection of these positive stories about corona warriors in China. The hard measures that were adopted were clearly censorship. I mean, to me, the Chinese Communist Party has basically mastered the art of nailing the jello to the wall. They know what they're doing. They are shrewd in terms of the use of social media from a feedback point of view, particularly when the central leadership needs to understand what's happening at local levels also, and how policies are being received, what are the sort of fault lines that can become bigger, and they are fairly attuned to what's going on over there. And that's one of their sort of objectives. There was an effort to sort of constrain coverage, which might have been critical. This was evident in local media in Wuhan and Hubei. And very quickly, across the board, the media was sort of whipped into line to sort of cover what the party state wanted them to cover. Of course, we then had censorship, and we had a sort of legislative and regulatory teeth given to this. In early February, the Cyberspace Administration sort of talked about creating a good environment Subsequently, there were guidelines issued by the Supreme People's Court. And then, of course, this quote about weeds in cyberspace and eradicating them is from People's Daily reporting about that particular guideline. There was a targeting of dissenters and journalists. This was evident, and even today we see there are trials that should be happening of people who've been detained for a very long time for having gone and done video recordings. Even a former CCTV journalist, Li Jiehua, if I remember correctly, there was a chase and he was tagged and he was then picked up. Some of these people were, of course, let go subsequently after a lengthy sort of house arrest or detention, but some of them faced consequences legally. And for months, while I was even writing this book, the people who'd been detained, there was no information about what are the kind of charges that they're going to face. And of course, all of this comes under that nebulous phrasing of spreading rumors, creating problems. Along with this, there was active spreading of disinformation. This became sort of through February in Chinese cyberspace. There was this sort of idea that where did the virus come from, and whether it is sort of biowarfare, just from abroad and all of that. And of course, in sort of by March 13th, we see our friend Li Jianchao sort of put that out in the public domain. And then, of course, everybody knows the contestation that's gone on for the last year and a bit now with regard to the origin of the virus. But also beyond that, right, there was tremendous contestation with the United States over a number of different issues, whether it's with regard to human rights, whether it's with regard to the efficiency of the Chinese system and the failures of the West. And in that, disinformation was critical. I think among the worst in this was the Chinese embassy in France, where at a certain point of time, the ambassador had spoken about, hospital staff leaving people to die. So I think some of this was about, actively spreading disinformation and creating issues in that sense. There was an effort which was active in conflating criticism of China's handling and the party's handling of the pandemic early on with racism and with legitimate issues of racism, I would say. Particularly in the West, we saw this, that there were legitimate issues of racism. And the moment that happened, or moment you had an image of a certain sort on the cover of a magazine or the paper, there was immediate sort of pushback from the Communist Party of China and ambassadors abroad. Lastly, there was an effort to demonstrate the comparative performance, particularly domestically and even abroad. The idea that, even today when we see China criticize the G7, it talks about how the US is sick and how collectively the G7 comprises so many cases and look at us. And that comparative sort of performance sort of measurement of that has continued even today. And it was at its peak, I would say, at some way throughout last year, while the party sort of still was anxious about domestic response. To me, again, this is one video that I can probably share with you guys to look at in terms of just how incredibly creative propaganda has become. This is a gamified version of pushing back on Pompeo's criticism of the party. Just to take 5 more minutes to end, because I know I'm running out of time, or I probably have already run out of time. But consequences and pitfalls, what's happened over the last year to me suggests that there's far more intensified central political control, and this is going to be the trend going forward as long as Xi Jinping is around. Increasingly, this is being written down in, in the party's sort of organization, department regulations, and this is going to sustain. And there is legitimacy from Xi Jinping's point of view. He's basically saying, and even from public point of view, that he's tackled what is and tackled very well, very efficiently, what has been a major crisis sort of unseen in the last century. There's vindication across the board about the effectiveness of the CCP-led system. And I think this engenders great confidence and hubris, which can lead to terrible policy consequences also. And also in terms of how the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy is playing out. There's a deeper sense of the West's decline. Again, some of the comments that I quote in the book reflect this, that there is this growing sense that the West is declining, it's stagnating, its political model is not delivering. And of course, this predates the pandemic, this sense, but the pandemic sort of deepens this particular sense. There's a greater emphasis domestically on ideology and nationalism. And for anybody who's been reading Chinese media for the last 6-8 months, a year, or even more than that now, but particularly the last year or so, what you would see is that there's a return to redness, and there's lots of talk about how the superiority of the Chinese system has been demonstrated not just because of the pandemic, but also poverty alleviation, governance efficiency, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, you need to be increasingly loyal because there are greater challenges coming up because you are succeeding. And of course, and as you are succeeding, the situation is going to get much more complicated. And that's leading to also a greater emphasis on the answer to all of this is stricter adherence to ideology, stricter adherence to the Leninist system of the party, and stricter adherence to national priorities. There's therefore a stronger perception of systemic competition with the West. This is evident. I don't need to go into details. And there's an urgency far greater in addressing supply chain and technological weaknesses. We saw this in April 2020 when Xi Jinping commented about, reducing China's vulnerabilities, particularly with regard to choke point technologies, and being able to create a system where you have the world that is far more dependent on you. At the same time, we're looking at this deeper conversation about core technologies and weaknesses in core technologies. And a short while ago, Xi Jinping had given a speech about to Chinese scientists, technology workers, and his broad comment was about needing to address this because this is going to be the battlefield of the future. And therefore, there's a greater urgency in doing that, and more money will go in there. Yet it remains to be seen whether the sort of industrial policy system will be able to deliver the kind of results that they need. My last slide talks about pitfalls, that was consequences. The pitfalls is that as a product of how 2020 has played out, what we're seeing is an acceleration of segmented globalization. I'm not one of those who says that decoupling is going to take place or is feasible or should be happening or any of that. To me, when I look at, and I sort of quote this in the book, I quote surveys from the American Chamber of Commerce, the European Chamber of Commerce, and they're basically telling us that if companies are not looking to leave China. It's not like there's an exodus that's happening. And China remains central to the global supply chain. Yet there is a conversation which has moved at a far more rapid pace than in the past about how do you reduce vulnerabilities. And this is evident in this Quad dialogue that's taken place with regard to emerging technologies. It's evident in the conversations that happen at the G7. Now, how these eventually play out and what incentives can be worked out, and whether companies would want to exit China, would want to have some sort of a China plus strategy. Those are things that we need to see. But the fact that we are moving in this direction, to me, is somewhat of a failure of Chinese foreign policy. The second thing is with regard to redness, and I've spoken about that as you emphasize more redness, more political loyalty, and you sort of prioritize those among the cadre, you can tend to dampen expertise. This is that old debate about red versus experts. And I think the debate is increasingly leaning towards greater redness. And that's a product of also how the pandemic was handled and what have been the consequences of it. And the challenge with that is that it may dampen expertise in the ability of the party to actually do the kind of things that Xi Jinping is talking about that they need to do. Innovate at grassroots level, create new nodes of growth, and all of that. And I think anybody who studied China's sort of economic miracle will sort of talk about how there was no one top-down China model. There were multiple models. There was tremendous local experimentation. Xi Jinping's father is an example of how local experimentation worked in the 80s and 90s. And I think that's changing. And that's going to create more challenges for the party. At the same time, as you do that, you will also create a new sort of breed of cadre who prioritize politics. And therefore, you're going to sort of reduce adaptability to crises. Because again, the system where do you want to sort of pass certain kinds of information up the chain? Do you want to share that information across? Those sorts of challenges, again, will come up. And that sort of makes the party far more rigid at the grassroots level. And again, Xi Jinping talks about being far more nimble at the grassroots level and being far more responsive and nipping problems in the bud. But what he's doing is sort of suggesting that's not really going to happen, that capacity is not being cultivated. The last 2 points is that, to me, the era of being strong, which is what he calls his era, from standing up, being rich to being strong, the era of being strong is distinct from the era of being rich. And at places where being rich conflicts with the goal of being strong, companies, enterprises, people can be sacrificed. That's what we're seeing in the technology sector, and the party sort of expanding control over capital, where it's saying that profit maximization becoming rich is not your primary goal. Your primary goal is to serve strategic ends, and if that comes in the way of profit maximization, so be it. And I think that's what's that's again going to be challenging to see how that plays out. And finally, of course, what after Xi? Firstly, when he seeks control, how he seeks control, all of that will have a critical role to play in terms of how the party is the party resilient going forward. And that question will only be answered whenever and however he decides to, or however he exits the stage, whether he decides to exit it or not. So I'll stop with that. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Manoj. It's been a fascinating sort of exegesis yours, and very sophisticated and differentiated. I think it's you've examined through the optic, through the sort of prism of the pandemic. You've actually examined a whole lot of things. So I'd like to now find out who would be interested in asking questions. I see one or two questions in the chat box, and Yogendra Kumar had asked, has his thumbs up, his raised hand option. So shall I ask Yogendra to start off with this question? Yeah, Yogi.
Thank you, sir. It's truly fascinating what Mr. Keval Ramani has just now stated. I've just one or two comments, come questions really. I mean, when you talk about superiority of system, which is what has been Xi Jinping's actually main point, there are no outlines of the model which other countries can follow, for example. I mean, I'm just thinking of the debate between Khrushchev and Nixon in Moscow, the exhibition where he said they're going to bury you. Now, it's very well to say that you've been able to control a crisis, but that doesn't tell as to how other countries can actually emulate your system. Now, as regards the redness of the ideology which has been propagated under Xi Jinping, I don't think anybody there so far, whoever has been opposed to the Communist Party narrative, has intended a counter-revolutionary, something which will actually happen during Mao's time, for example. So, and just one more point, in terms of the crisis, what kind of a challenge does an active social media actually present to the government, let's say, propaganda forward? Thank you.
Manoj, would you like to straight away answer, or would you like to take some more questions?
No, I think I'll straight away answer, and I'll try and keep my answers concise. So thank you so much for the question. So if I understood correctly, the first thing is how applicable, how exportable is the model, right? To me, I don't think that the party itself believes that the model is terribly exportable, because at the end of the day, if you want to believe that your model is exportable, it sort of challenges this notion of also exceptionalism that the party has cultivated, this historical exceptionalism. So I don't think that themselves believe that. What they do believe, however, is that there is tremendous purchase outside with regard to certain issues on, say, human rights. There's tremendous purchase with regard to the argument that the Chinese are making in large parts of the world. And they're trying to sort of shape the discourse around norms of human rights by using the argument saying, look, this is what's worked for us. We prioritize development over political rights, and you can try the same too. The other component of the model from an economic point of view that I can think of is this notion of build and, business will come and profits will come and development will come. And you can see that being exported through BRI directly. And again, that draws from the performance legitimacy that the party has displayed at home. And that's why it's and it's trying to export that economic model in some way, which from the outside, the criticism for that is this is a debt trap. From the Chinese government's point of view is that, look, this is how we grew. And it's evident in Chinese sort of debt going up in a certain, to where it is today. So I think there's elements of that. There's elements of the poverty alleviation campaign that they're trying to share with African countries and Latin American countries. And I think that's where we should think about this notion of exporting the model. I don't think it's necessarily just an export of the entire party state system. The last point that I would make on this exporting of model thing is, it's also useful because you are trying to, and they're doing this rapidly domestically, to create new regulations, new norms, new standards for new technologies. And that's critical because unless you have your domestic system in place, you can't necessarily be shaping these sort of international standards that are coming up. And they are doing this far more rapidly, whether it's with regard to privacy, whether it's with regard to data regulation. They're doing this far more quickly. And at the end of the day, as these become norms which are far more acceptable internationally, you've exported the model that you wanted to export. So in that context is what I would look at the export of the model.
Very interesting, Manoj. You mentioned that even in your report on the on the party's thing today, where he said that they don't really consider it exportable, but it's a kind of a norm that they're seeing for themselves, which other people may draw lessons from. Before I give Suresh Goel the floor, let me just refer to the chat box. There are two questions. One from Prabir Chakravarti saying, as per your views, is the current virus man-made? The second is from Dhara Shah, which says that does China's perception of systemic competition also extend to India, or is it limited to disdain, over the power disparity between New Delhi and Beijing? With China having emerged as our largest trading partner, how do you assess India's efforts to reduce the economic vulnerabilities from China?
So the first point was about whether the virus is man-made.
Yes.
So that's a little beyond my expertise. My scientific skills, I would sort of defer to biologists and epidemiologists to that. But from whatever I have understood, I don't see sufficient evidence to say that it is man-made so far. That doesn't mean that it possibly is not. But so far, I don't see sufficient evidence. The only thing that I'd add to that is the nature of the debate around this only makes it far more difficult to try and figure out what's going on, if we could have anyway ever figured out a year later as to what's going on. So, I mean, that's the only thing that I can say on that. In terms of, sorry, Ambassador, what was the other question?
The second one was Dhara Shah. It talks about Chinese perception of competition with India, and also the effect of economic sanctions imposed by India against China after Galwan. He says, right. How do you assess the India's efforts?
Right. So I don't think they necessarily see India from the point of view of a system that they're competing with, a governance system that they're competing with. It can potentially be one, and I think at a certain point in history it was one. But I don't think today that's the case. I think their primary contestation is with the United States. India is not irrelevant, of course. India is a key regional competitor in an extremely important region. India is a pivot state from their point of view. And so I don't think it's irrelevant in that sense, even though it may not be the systemic competitor that they're looking at. Because Indian diplomacy is not about exporting values. It's not about exporting democracy. And that's very clear, particularly with regard to, say, what's happened in Myanmar recently. We abstained along with the Chinese. So I don't think that in that sense, they are seeing this as a challenge. And again, we've not commented on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or even Tibet for that matter. Apart from very sort of oblique comments on Tibet. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they look at us in that context as a systemic competitor. As a regional rival, yes, and as a sort of key actor in their contest with the United States, yes, they do see us as a key player in that. In terms of our the sort of economic measures that we use to try and coerce them, I don't think we have the economic power at present to coerce them. Our trade with them, our sort of export to them comprises of about 2-3%, very small, a very minuscule percent of China's overall imports. Our purchases from them don't comprise of a massive amount of Chinese imports also. So I don't think we have the capacity at the moment. Also, it's in many ways, when we sort of impose certain sanctions, particularly with regard to goods that we are purchasing from China, it's important that we are very careful in that, because we may end up hurting our own exports. From what I understand, from the point of view of foreign value added in Indian exports, Chinese imports comprise about 34-35%. That's a huge component of our exports. So I think we need to be careful in what we do. If the goal of those sanctions were to signal that we won't be pursuing normal relations unless things on the border are fine, I think that's a message that's been sent. If the objective was to coerce change in the border through that particular tool, I don't think the tool has enough capacity to be able to do that. So I think, therefore, we need to be careful. I think what's more important is when we try and partner with others, whether we did that with 5G and Huawei, or whether we are now partnering with the Quad on emerging technologies, and we try and actually reshape the future. That's when I think we acquire far greater capacity to do that. I want to add one more point with regard to India and China. To me, and I'm sure we've all been wondering about why did the Chinese do what they did in Ladakh, and what did they gain, what did they lose strategically? To me, their objective has been to, and I've gradually sort of come to this thinking, is to try and constrain our choices and constrain our options and our maneuverability. To me, they're observing how far can we go with the US, how far is the US willing to go with us, and also how does our relationship with Russia factor into all of this? Because all of these sort of constrain how much we can maneuver. And from their point of view, I think they're sort of observing how far we can move.
Yeah, beautiful. Good. I'll ask Ambassador Goel now to ask his question. Go ahead, Suresh.
Sir, thank you very much. Manoj, I must say that I've thoroughly enjoyed your presentation today on Chinese quest for geopolitical dominance. In fact, I was reading a comment yesterday in a paper, I forget which paper it was, but that was a very interesting comment. And there, the book which I have not read suggests that India and China have always really had a quest for different sources of the power, while China focused on the hard power and building basically a hard power capabilities. India was basically focusing on peace and diplomacy. I think that was a very, very telling comment really on different approaches from India and China. My question to you is not on India and China, but purely China really, and the geopolitical context in which China works. What do you think is the beginning of this quest? Because if you look at the ancient history of China, even the Ming dynasty, their definition of the concept of the world was very limited. They didn't know at that time Europe or Central Asia perhaps, yes, but they didn't know where Europe was. They didn't know the USA. Nobody knew where it is. So what was the origin of this quest? And when did this begin? That is number one, because to me, I think if it is a modern quest in which India and China have become contestants, we need to look at China in a different manner. But if India is not really part of this quest, then we don't need to really think of China as a contender. Number two, of late in the statements coming from China, you find lots of arrogant, very abusive kind of comments. Now, in your assessment, is it actually arrogance of power, or is it diffidence on their part that the world is not able to accept China as it is, which has shown that its system is actually working and that they're able to get over the economic hump much faster than the world? So is it diffidence or arrogance? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Let me take your second question first about this nature of new diplomacy. As with most things in China, there is a dichotomy and there is a contradiction. And I think the thing is that there is tremendous anxiety and there is a sense of grief and grievance that exists, which is why you're seeing some of this anger. But also, I think why we are seeing some of this anger is because the nature of diplomacy is also because you feel that, and the system feels that that is what needs to be done. Because of the kind of criticism that they have gotten. And if you need to compete, you need to compete aggressively. Again, we need to realize that the present generation of Chinese adults, people who maybe even younger than me in their 20s, 30s, are people who grew up with patriotic education. Their sort of worldview is very different. Their sense of what China should be doing in the world, particularly after having acquired this capacity and power, is very different. There was a point of time where for the foreign ministry would be sort of lampooned and being told that you need to grow a spine. Particularly when sort of in 2012, when the sort of tensions happened with the Japanese. So I think there's a certain nationalism at home too for them that they need to assuage. And we can see this with what's happened with Global Times journalists recently, and Global Times, as nationalistic as a tabloid as one can be, got criticized when some of their journalists, and even their editor-in-chief, Hu Shijin, started talking about that particular graphic, which was horribly racist, terrible about India's situation. But he got criticized and he got lampooned. So I think there is a nationalism at home, which is problematic. But there's also a system which believes that we need to compete far more vigorously because we deserve some of these we deserve some of the credit, we deserve some of the space, and the only way to create space is to compete aggressively. And when Xi Jinping talks about, and Wang Yi talk about, having fighting spirit in our diplomats, and when Zhao Lijian gets promoted from, a deputy at the Islamabad embassy to the spokesperson and sort of hired up in the foreign ministry, it sends a signal across the diplomatic system, across the diplomatic cadre, that this is what we need. So I think that's one thing that's playing out. So there are institutional issues, there are sense of self-perception, plus there is nationalism and all of that. And again, obviously for you, all of you who sort of lived with, who sort of exercised diplomacy, this might not be new. I mean, I was recently reading, Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin's book, and he has a quote in there from Nehru talking about, how aggressive and vile the Chinese diplomats are, and how, and he's wondering whether they seem to think this is effective diplomacy. And I think today we are wondering very similarly whether this is effective diplomacy. So I think it's not new in that sense. So first question that you had about, are we in a new sort of situation? Is this sort of quest new? To me, this sort of quest is shaped by the late 1800s and the 1900s and sort of early 1900s in that era. I don't think it necessarily goes back far. Yes, you can go back far and say that, yes, at a certain point of time, you had this Middle Kingdom mentality, this sense of China being one of the biggest global actors, if not the biggest global actor, the biggest contributor to global GDP and all of that. And of course, the center for culture and all of that. But I think this is more modern because it's driven by the sense of grievance that has been nurtured, particularly even more so after the 1990s, after Tiananmen Square. And I think this is driven by that. And I think from an Indian point of view, at an early stage, yes, I think our approaches to power were very different. Our conceptualizations were very different in some ways, and because of our historical experiences, which were very different. But at a certain sense, I think realism sort of took far greater hold in Indian foreign policy also. So I don't think that today there is that much of a difference. I think there are limitations in terms of systems and how we approach and history and all of that. But I don't think there's a difference. I think there's a realization that we need to build capacity. The challenge is that our politics in India, unfortunately, is fighting 500-year-old battles and not battles of the next 20 years. So if we do that better, then we sort of obviously do better. But I think this sort of contest is much more modern. This quest is much more modern, and it's driven by the grievance of the late 1800s and the early 1900s.
Thank you, Manoj. That's a very interesting, detailed answer to his question. I have Ravi would like to ask a question. Ravi Bhuthalingam. Mr. Bhuthalingam, please carry on.
Thank you, Vijay. Manoj, congratulations on a really fluent, very, very cogent presentation. I enjoyed every minute of it. I've got two questions. One takes off on your title, which has the word war in it. So I would like to suggest that the mode of fighting the virus, the war mode of fighting the virus, evokes what you might call a war leadership model. A war leadership model may be very successful, but that war leadership model may not be the right model for peace leadership. An example is Winston Churchill, of course, a great war hero, but he lost the election immediately afterward. So is there a debate in China that whatever has proved effective, and it's been fantastically effective. In fact, I would refer you to some articles, I don't have the references with me, both in Harvard Business Review and in the McKinsey Quarterly, which look at virus management strategies, COVID management strategies from the angle of management leadership qualities. And a lot of the things China has done come out in those. So is there a debate in China about how the war effectiveness of Xi Jinping strategy, is it really or can it be relevant when there is peace? Or is Xi Jinping trying to, as George Orwell suggests in his book 1984, have a state of perpetual war? I mean, war in quotation marks, but a besieged China, which is kind of sorry about this. This phone is ringing. A besieged China, which is really in a state of war. My second question is about the exportability of the China model. And here I would like to refer to BRI. And the question I want to ask is BRI really a model? Or is it a variety of models? Is it a very fluid, flexible model where the BRI avatar in Pakistan is very different from the BRI in Eastern Europe or in Malaysia? So maybe the model itself has an inbuilt flexibility, and this may be, in fact, one of the attractions of BRI to many developing countries. Thank you very much once again, Manoj.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both those questions. So on the first point, with regard to is there debate in China about this wartime effort? I don't. At least if there is, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it at all, and that's one of my biggest criticisms of Chinese foreign policy is that there is very little reflection and debate about the effectiveness of what's being done and what's happening, and what are the long-term challenges with regard to this emphasis on ideology. Because the moment you emphasize ideology, you also emphasize differences and you also emphasize contest. And I think across Xi Jinping's tenure, there has been a greater securitization of society. If you look at his concept of overall national security, he's basically saying every domain of society, every domain of existence is relevant to national security, whether it's culture, whether it's television, whether it's economics, whether it's security at the border, all of that. And therefore, that sort of permeates into how you approach all of this. And that siege mentality that it then generates, because you need to have a siege mentality to be able to do that. And I think I don't see the reflection, even if it's taking place, I don't think it's taking place at a level where Xi Jinping is hearing it or wants to hear it. So on that count, I don't see that taking place. With regard to BRI, I agree with you. I think BRI is very nebulous. And I think the Chinese tell us that when they say that BRI is not just about infrastructure, it's also about media, it's also about, the sort of soft norms with regard to trade, customs, all those sorts of issues. It's about just about everything. And therefore, it's very different because your interests in different countries are very, very different. And the comparative advantages that different countries offer are very, very different. So I completely agree with you. I think that in that sense, I don't think that's an export of model necessarily. When it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to manufacturing, I think there's a certain experience, I would call it an export of experience, which can then sort of feed the model or whatever. But I think that from the point of view of the other things, I think it's about deepening China's networks with different countries or shaping perceptions in different countries about China. And I wouldn't classify that as exporting a model. So that's how I sort of look at BRI.
There are two more questions from the chat box. One, I'm not sure what kind of question it is by Radha Raghuram Patruni. It's during the pandemic, India had sanctions against China, but we are importing oxygen concentrators and raw materials from the pharma sector. And some manufacturing commodities are cheaper when you import from China. So she wants your views on that. And we in India should revive our manufacturing sector. I think that's self-evident. But anyway, the second question asked is, the point made on securing the future by reshaping norms in pursuit of legitimacy, is the approach taken by China in reshaping norms only aimed at how China and its actions are perceived, or is it also to influence on actions and functioning of other states too? This is asked by Sanjana Krishnan.
So thank you so much. I think the first point, I agree with you, it's self-evident. We need to invest in manufacturing and for that, there's a lot that needs to happen, which again is, I'm not an economist. I don't want to venture into that area. But from the point of view of, importing goods from China during the pandemic, and I've written about this in a column in the Hindustan Times where I basically said that I understand political compulsions and diplomatic compulsions of, because from what I understand, the Chinese also offered us aid, and if it came faster in April, I would have said yes, because to me, the most important thing was, had been at that point of time was to save lives and to reduce the impact of the pandemic across the board. Because like we are seeing today, it's in rural India, and it's having a tremendous human, economic, and eventually even political cost in terms of how India recovers and then rises from this. So if anything that went to aid that, I understand. But I understand the sort of political compulsions for not accepting that. On the point of shaping of norms, at present, my understanding is that what the Chinese are essentially trying to do is that they're trying to create a world safer for them, and a world more sort of more amenable to them and their operations outside. In that, they're obviously making common cause with many countries, Russia included. And again, this is not the first time in history that on norms like human rights, you're seeing the Chinese make common cause. So on sort of human rights specifically, I think that the Chinese are essentially looking at themselves, and in that they're making common cause with others. On the issue of, say, technology standards, I think that's where they're shaping norms for the others also. And I think that's the important area for us to keep an eye on, because whether it's with regard to, say, lethal autonomous weapon system, or whether it's with regard to data regulation, data sharing norms and standards, I think they are very keen to shape the future. And that will then impact everybody else, because these are new norms. These are not existing norms which needs to be changed. So in that sense, yes, it'll they will shape it for the rest of the world also, and that's what their agenda is.
Thank you. There's one more question which is slightly provocative, but I'll read it out in any case. China feels now prominently that it is the world's superpower, and aggressive expansionist policies put India at a centerpiece to exhibit its powerlessness. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that again, if that was their objective, I don't think they achieved it. It's not like they ran roughshod over India. So I don't think that they showcased India as powerless. Yes, they did sort of showcase, it did, the way the things played out, it did sort of showcase that there's much more that we should have done. And there's much more that we should have done, not just on the ground, but also politically, how we responded to it was, in my view, deeply problematic, at least to begin with. But I think that in the sort of long terms, if you were to look at China, which calls itself, and Chinese media says this, we are 5 times more powerful, you don't stand a chance, and the rest of it, yet they've barely been able to achieve anything on the ground. And they've actually sort of strategically also hurt themselves in terms of pushing India in a certain direction. Of course, I don't see it as strategic defeat, because I think, like I said, there's a constraining of India's policies, and there's a testing of also the limits of how far we can go and where we can go and how we can maneuver, and that they're observing. But I don't think that, it's shown India as powerless. It's shown India as a country that has to exercise different options. And I think we've sort of muddled our way through trying to do that. Our record has not been great, but we've muddled our way through it.
Thank you. There's one final, I think, rather than summing up, I'll just ask or reflect, seek your views on 2 reflections about the differences between India and China in terms of, one, what you call state agencies and state agency in terms of tackling things like the pandemic. The kind of things which you've had, you said people's war. India also talked about people's war. But unlike, whereas other places, when other instances, where we've had a warlike situation where the country as a whole has stood up as one. In the case of the pandemic, this has not been the case. In fact, I think state agency has been challenged at all levels. State governments have challenged the center, civil society has challenged the state, the government, and there's been a kind of a, I wouldn't say you use the word muddling through, but in some ways there's been a muddling at all levels, and the kind of stridency in response to the pandemic, which was sorted, did not work out for many reasons. I suppose this is endemic to the system we have. The second is your question regarding freedom as a societal value, which you mentioned. This again is very interesting, because in many respects we also look upon freedom as societal values, but with a difference. In fact, the famous quotation, "Tyajete ekam kulasyarthe gramarthe kulam tyajet Gramam Janapadasya is all fine. China also does it. But our last point, Atmarthe Prithvim Tyajet, I don't think the Chinese have. Because, you can perhaps, discount, you can sacrifice the entire world for what you think is your individual salvation or individual soul. Now that, of course, it is there in perhaps in Taoist thinking, but it's not really operational. Whereas in India, it's almost operational on a daily level. And how do you look at these two things?
Right. So on the first point, Master Namir, my sort of view is this, that the reason that I think we have not done, or we didn't do well, despite it being a wartime effort, is because when you're fighting a war on the border, there's a different capacity, there's a different training, there's a different preparation, and you're prepared for an eventuality. Despite us having sufficient notice that this was coming, we didn't prepare, firstly. Secondly, even if we had prepared, there is a fundamental issue of state capacity in India at all levels. The ability of the and reach the last mile is very different. The ability of the state to mobilize resources, like say what the Chinese could do, is very, very different. And I think to me, the failure was from the point of view of state capacity, of the inability to the state to deliver. In terms of what I mean when I say that there is greater agency to the state, the fact that the moment this happened around the world, there was a realization that you need government and state to address this. You can't have privatization, you can't have that, you can't have individual liberties, and you need to suspend certain liberties if you have to address this. The challenge why I argue that going forward, we are going to see far more of state, sort of the state overwhelming, or at least becoming far more overbearing, is because whatever we are experiencing right now, nobody's talking about sunset clauses in legislation. Nobody's talking about that. Today, if I'm signing into an app to give my location to the government, to give my health data, nobody's talking about who's taking my data where. And that conversation is essentially stamped down the moment I say it, because whether I'm being anti-national, whether I'm not supporting the broader wartime effort, and so on and so forth. So I think once you sort of hardcode these things in regulations, and once this becomes the experience, governments in the state has a really smart way of making sure that continues. That's where I make that argument that I think state agency is going to be far stronger. As far as the idea of freedom as a societal value, I agree. I think in India, it's very similar. I wish it was, from my point of view, that we were to start putting individual freedom at a national value level, and that sort of informs our laws and regulations, but I don't necessarily see that happening. And I see the good thing from an Indian point of view is that there is freedom to challenge that logic and philosophy. Logic and philosophy can be challenged in courts, and it can be overturned, which is what we saw some years ago when we saw privacy being declared a fundamental right. So the good thing in India is that we can actually do that. The unfortunate thing in China is doing that is extremely, extremely difficult. And at present, it seems next to impossible.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a fascinating discussion, Manoj. I'm sure that the entire audience will agree with me that you brought an immensity of detail, granular detail, and at the same time, you've been, the kind of the rather larger differentiated perspective you build. It's not even. I haven't seen even one page of it which is polemical in any way, and I think that is what distinguishes your work from the many other works that we see emanating from India. And I'm seeing this increasingly, which is a very good sign, I think, in terms of scholarship on China that is emerging here. Thank you very much. I don't know whether there's anything more that I can do in terms of summarizing the discussion, because it has been fairly wide-ranging, and I think it certainly whets the appetite of people to read the book and perhaps read it more than once. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's anything else which Samanvay or Rija would like to say. Thank you.
If I could just say thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Ambassador Nambiar. Thank you so much, everyone at ICS. And my apologies for my network. I'm terribly sorry.
Thank you. Okay, is that the end? Then I think with that note, we will call this meeting to an end. It's already 4.